Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be digging into this one.
Yeah, today we're tackling something that's really fundamental to an experience millions of us have pretty much every day, player choice. In video games,
That's right.
we've got this stack of sources looking at, well, what is choice in a game? How does it actually work?
And maybe, just maybe, what the choices you make in there might say about you, the player.
It's definitely more complex than just, pressing a button when prompted.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
These sources really frame modern games as these intricate systems, just full of potential points where your decisions, your input, genuinely shapes what happens next.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, let's unpack these sources. We want to understand the kind of anatomy of player choice.
Look at the story implications, the psychological side, too.
Right, and how games deal with consequences of fallout from those choices.
And maybe peek ahead a little. What's the future look like for meaningful decisions in interactive stuff?
We'll get into how designers think about the choices they give you, how those choices then carve out your specific path through the game.
And what all that might tell you, or, the developers about who's holding the controller.
Okay, let's get into it. So, the sources start with this fundamental idea. Games, at their core, are really about choice.
Yeah, that's the argument. They're not just linear stories you passively consume.
Yeah.
They're built around moments where things could go differently.
And there's a term for these moments, right? The sources call them.
Nodal situations. Or sometimes just nodes.
Nodes, okay.
Yeah.
So that's a specific point in the game's structure. Could be story, could be just the environment.
Where there's more than one way forward, more than one possibility for what happens next.
Right. And because games have these nodes built in, they kind of preserve possibility, right? They keep things open. One source actually calls them a type of future narrative.
Future narrative. I like that. Because the future of the game in that instant isn't fixed.
It holds all these potential paths.
Until you, the player, step in at that node and, make a choice. Collapse the possibilities.
So you've got the game's architecture on one hand, that's the underlying rules, the systems, all the potential nodes and branches the designers laid out.
And then you've got your specific run, your playthrough.
Which is your unique journey through all that potential. It only becomes a fixed, linear story after you've made the choices.
Exactly. Your choices turn potential into history, basically.
But it's not just about those big, obvious story branches or dialogue options, is it? The sources really widen the lens on what counts as a choice.
Yeah, they look at decisions we're making constantly, sometimes without even thinking about them as, major choices.
Like what?
Well, the most frequent one, maybe surprisingly, in any game with a navigable space, is just spatial choice. Where do you go?
Just moving around?
Yeah, even when designers fence you in a bit, deciding, which corridor to take, which building to explore first, which direction to head off in, that can totally change your experience.
Like the Fallout 3 example they mentioned.
Yeah. Exactly. Going straight for the main objective via the dangerous subway tunnels versus, wandering the open wasteland first.
Totally different feel, different encounters, different side stories discovered. Same end goal maybe, but the journey.
Completely shaped by those movement choices. Then you've got objective choices.
Right. What do you actually decide to do? Focus on the main quest line?
Or do you get sucked into every side quest, every optional area, every crafting system the game throws at you?
Some games are pretty linear, right? Level 1, then level 2.
Yeah, they funnel you through objectives sequentially. But others, again, like Fallout 3, just dump a load of markers on your map and basically say, have at it, do what you want when you want.
That's a different kind of freedom, a different set of choices about how you spend your time in that world.
And character development choices. That's another big one. How do you build your avatar?
Skill trees, attribute points.
Right. Are you going all in on combat? Becoming a smooth talker by boosting social stats? Focusing on stealth or crafting?
And the sources point out these choices are often, pretty permanent for that playthrough. They really define your role.
They lock you into certain ways of playing or interacting, which is kind of the point of role-playing, I guess.
And then, of course, the ones we maybe think of first, dialogue choices.
Yep. Selecting what to say in conversations. Games like Heavy Rain or Mass Effect. Even when it's just a paraphrase of the line.
Those choices can dramatically change relationships with other characters, unlock information, or send the whole plot spinning off in a new direction.
So, okay, if games are about making choices, how do they actually give you the information you need to make them?
That's a good question. The sources make a distinction here.
There's the info that's purely about the game mechanics, the interface. Like, press X to jump.
Or a little icon telling you which button does what. The sources call that textual commentary. It's info about the game, not really in the game world.
Right. And then there's what they call visual commentary. This is where gameplay information is presented as if it's part of the fictional world.
Like a glowing aura around an object you can pick up.
Exactly. Or a big floating arrow pointing you to your next quest objective.
You see it, you understand its gameplay purpose.
But it's visually integrated into the scene, even though, your character probably doesn't see a giant floating arrow. It helps you choose how to interact with the environment.
And this whole process where players take the abstract rules and the button prompts and the glowing objects and weave them into a meaningful fictional experience, the sources call that semanticization.
Semanticization.
Right.
Is how you transform the game's mechanics into a coherent story world.
The story world being that fictional context where your actions, the game's rules, actually gain significance beyond just, inputs and outputs.
And here's a really interesting point the sources make. Games often deliberately hide the precise gameplay consequences of a choice.
What do you mean?
Like, you make a dialogue choice or decide to help someone, but you might not know exactly how many good guy points you'll get, or if it leads to a specific item later.
Ah, okay. So they don't always show you the math behind it.
Right. And the idea is that this pushes you away from thinking purely in terms of gameplay rationality, just doing whatever gives you the best stats or reward.
And encourages you to focus more on the story world significance. What feels like the right thing to do within the fiction. What choice makes sense for your character in that world?
Which leads us neatly into a really potent example of this. Moral choices.
Yeah, this is where it gets really juicy, I think.
Moral choices are singled out as like a key type of semantic choice because they really force you to interpret what's happening through an ethical lens that the story world provides.
You're not just thinking, will this help me win, but is this the right thing to do within the context of this fictional universe?
Exactly. You understand the decision has a moral dimension, a moral value within the game's fiction.
And this creates that tension the sources talk about between gameplay rationality,
doing what's optimal for game progression,
and acting as an ethical being.
Right. Doing what feels morally right according to the story world's values, even if it makes the game harder or gives you fewer rewards. And games are exploring ways to make those two things align, or sometimes deliberately clash.
So how do games actually implement these moral choices? How do they track them?
Lots of ways. The most obvious is maybe multiple endings. Your overall moral standing or specific key choices determine the final outcome. We see that in games like BioShock, Fallout, New Vegas, Heavy Rain.
Right. Good ending, bad ending, maybe something in between.
But it's not just the ending. Games can give you more immediate narrative feedback, too.
Like what?
The sources mention things like in Mass Effect 2, if you save someone, you might later get a message, a letter from them, acknowledging it.
Ah, okay. A smaller consequence that reinforces the choice.
Or something really striking like in Metal Gear Solid 3, there's this sequence where you wade through a river, and the number of enemies you've killed throughout the game determines how many ghostly bodies are floating in that river.
Whoa, that's impactful.
Yeah, it gives this visceral narrative weight to actions that might have just felt like standard gameplay moment to moment.
And then there are the explicit systems, the meters.
The karma systems, yeah. Fallout's classic good-bad scale is a famous one.
Mass Effect had the separate Paragon and Renegade meters, right? So you could be strongly one or the other, or kind of neutral.
Right. And way back, Ultima the Thief was tracking multiple different virtues like compassion, justice, honor.
Wow, okay, so not just a simple good devil slider.
No. And other games track things differently too. Infamous looked at selfish versus selfless choices. Overlords had a corruption meter based on how evil you were. It's not always just a binary.
It seems like designing these systems is pretty complex.
Definitely. In one study, the Sources site looked into this. They compared games with moral choices to similar games without them.
And what did they find?
Interestingly, players who engaged with the moral decisions reported not just higher levels of meaningfulness from the game,
Okay, that makes sense.
but also higher enjoyment. So tackling those ethical dilemmas didn't make the game less fun. It actually seemed to enhance both aspects.
Huh. So the complexity added to the experience overall.
It seems so in that study. But crucially, they didn't find that playing the game with moral choices significantly changed players' real-world pro-social attitudes afterwards.
Oh, really? So making good choices in the game didn't necessarily make people more altruistic outside the game.
Not in that specific experiment, no. It suggests the impact, or maybe the transfer of that impact, is complicated. The meaningfulness might be strongly felt within the context of the game itself.
Which brings us to the player. Why do you, the person playing, make the choices you do? This really gets into player psychology.
Yeah, the sources touch on different motivations, like why does one player just blast through the main story?
While someone else spends 100 hours finding every single collectible and doing every side quest.
Right. Maybe the first person just wants to see the ending, experience the core narrative. Or maybe, as one source suggests, the second person just really loves being in that specific game world and wants to soak up every bit of it.
Some games even encourage that, right? Locking main story progress behind side activities.
Exactly. Rewarding that exploration. And then there's the whole phenomenon of build crafting or theory crafting.
Ah, yes. People spending ages outside the game, on forums or wikis, planning their perfect character build.
Analyzing stats, skills, gear combinations. It sounds maybe a bit intense. One source even calls it pretty nerdy.
Yeah.
But it's a genuine way players engage deeply with the game's possibility space, even when they're not actively playing.
What about just picking how your character looks? Avatar customization, why do people choose what they choose?
The sources list a few reasons. Simple aesthetics, they just like the look.
The rule of cool.
The rule of cool, absolutely. Or sometimes a desire to completely disconnect from their real-life identity.
To be someone else entirely.
Exactly. Or maybe to embody a specific type of person or fantasy they find appealing.
And there were those stats mentioned about players choosing avatars of a different gender.
Yeah, that was interesting. Reasons people give online often include things like, well, more interesting cosmetic options sometimes.
Okay.
Again, that rule of cool, or that explicit desire to step away from their real-world self and fully embrace a different role.
And the sources stress that the reason behind a choice is important too.
Right. It adds another layer. Did you save that NPC because it felt like the right thing to do in the story?
Or because you knew you'd get a really good weapon as a reward.
Or maybe just because you wanted to impress another character in the game. Your motivation can be more complex, more revealing perhaps, than just the action itself.
So does our game behavior reflect our real selves?
It's suggested that, well, sometimes it can be an extension of you, yeah? Or it can be a safe space to try out different ways of being. But that exploration is often temporary, kind of contained within the game.
Except maybe
In online games, where you're interacting with other real people. How you treat them in the digital space might have a stronger connection to your offline behavior. That's a possibility raised.
Okay, let's talk consequences. Choices have consequences, obviously.
Yeah, that's true in any system. But video games, because they're dynamic computational systems, they can track and show an incredible range and complexity of consequences based on your choices.
But we also have things like save files, right? Checkpoints.
Exactly. Features like save load, checkpoints, even just having a health bar that goes down slowly instead of instant death. These are all design choices.
They make games less frustrating, more accessible.
Definitely. But the sources argue this also changes the perceived weight of your decisions. If you can just reload after a bad outcome, does the choice feel as significant as it might in a system with permanent consequences like permadeath?
That's a good point. It lowers the stakes, in a way.
It can, yeah. Though going back to that study on moral choices.
Right. The one that found moral choices increase both meaning and enjoyment.
Yes. It shows that consequences and ethical weight, even within the game's safe space, can really deepen engagement and make the experience richer. It's not just about avoiding frustration.
So, looking ahead, what's next?
Well, technology keeps marching on. More computing power, more sophisticated AI. This could lead to much more dynamic, emergent narratives.
Meaning?
Meaning instead of designers scripting out every single branching path, the game world itself, the NPCs, the environment systems, could react to your actions in really complex, maybe even unpredictable ways.
Creating truly unique stories for each player, not just variations on pre-planned themes.
Potentially, yes. We see glimmers of this already in things like Left 4 Dead's AI Director, which adjusts the challenge based on how you're playing or the kind of systemic world interactions you see in games like Skyrim.
And it's not just about tech, right? The sources mention artistic approaches, too.
Absolutely. The drive for photorealism isn't the only way. Stylized visuals, abstract graphics, they can be just as powerful, maybe sometimes more powerful, for conveying narrative meaning and supporting player choice.
It doesn't have to look real to feel meaningful.
Not at all. And games can also crank up the impact of choices by, maybe counterintuitively, making certain actions less frequent.
How so?
Well, they contrast the weight of deciding whether to kill one specific character in a narrative-heavy game like Heavy Rain.
Versus mowing down hundreds of generic enemies in a typical shooter.
Right. That constant repetition in the shooter can kind of desensitize you, making a significant action, like taking a life, a rare and deliberate choice, can make the consequence feel much, much heavier.
Makes sense. Scarcity creates value, even for actions.
And finally, there's this idea the sources float about artistic maturity for games.
What does that entail?
It might mean designers moving beyond the idea that every game needs a clear winning state, exploring things like unwinnable games, or what some call anti-game.
Anti-games, like games that critique being games. Sort of. The example given is a game called September 12th. It's designed to make a point about the cycle of violence and counterterrorism. You fire missiles at targets, but doing so inevitably creates more terrorists.
So there's no way to win.
There's no winning condition. The game's message is embedded in the inescapable negative feedback loop of your actions. The point, perhaps, is that the only winning move is not to play that particular game, not to engage in that action.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
quite a concept. Using the game's rules to question the actions themselves.
Exactly. Exploring these kinds of self-reflexive or difficult themes could be part of games growing as an artistic medium.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big picture here? We've seen that player choice in games is, well, way more involved than just picking A or B on a menu.
Definitely. It's about navigating these really complex systems, reading between the lines of how information is presented.
And engaging with these fictional story worlds on a level that can feel deeply personal. Right. Games really leverage our basic human instinct to make narratives, to find meaning in actions and rules. And moral choices really throw that into sharp relief.
Making us juggle the game's goals with our own sense of what's right, even if it's all just pixels and code.
Precisely. Even if the consequences are purely digital, the decision-making process can feel very real.
And it is fascinating how those decisions, from how we make our character look to who we save or sacrifice in the story, can reflect different parts of us.
Yeah, are we playing as ourselves,
Yeah.
an idealized version? Or are we using the game as a sandbox to explore totally different ways of being?
The tech is only going to get more complex, promising potentially even more reactive worlds.
More sophisticated systems, and maybe deeper, more nuanced ways for us to feel like our choices truly matter.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you with. We've talked about how immersive games can be, how they can present us with these really complex scenarios, sometimes even moral dilemmas. So how might exploring those difficult, maybe even unwinnable situations inside a game, how might that influence how we think about or approach similar, really messy, complex problems in the real world?
That's a deep question.
Yeah. And what kinds of stories, what kinds of insights can only really be explored when a simple win isn't the goal or isn't even possible? Something to chew on.